help along with making a delicious meal tonight. My name is Garrison Price. I'm your Q&A chef tonight. So few housekeeping rules. Obviously, I think we're all Zoom pros at this point, but staying on mute is great just so we can make sure we focus our attention on the main event and be able to hear everyone. If you would, definitely open up the chat box. That's where I will be inserting the ingredient measurements, many of the tips and tricks that we have throughout the class this evening. And then also your avenue to ask any questions that you might have, if we need to slow things down a little bit to all get on the same page. Obviously, we'd love to see what you're making. So if you come on camera, we can help you troubleshoot throughout the class. And I guess that's about it for me. But opening up that chat box, and then I will also pin the main event. We have Chef Adrianna with us this evening. She has two cameras, so one straight on, and then she has her overhead camera. If you can find those, and if you'd like to pin those, you go to the upper right-hand corner with your cursor to the three dots, and you can pin those videos, that overhead one being the most important today. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Chef Adrianna. Take it away.
Thank you, Chef. Welcome, everybody. I'm Chef Adrianna. I am a private chef and health coach based in New York City. I'm very excited about making some focaccia together today. I'm sure if any of you are on social media, you've been seeing this a lot lately. So this is your chance to maybe learn something new and use those art skills to get a little creative with our veggies and whatnot a little bit later on. Is anybody making the gluten-free focaccia? If so, feel free to pop into the chat just so we know to walk you through that recipe as well. It's a little bit different than our regular gluten-filled flour recipe. So please do pop in the chat just so we know to keep track of the gluten-free. So first thing, I love this. We have a musician. So first thing, let's get our ovens preheated to 425. So that's just straight 425. It is a hot oven. If you have convection, I recommend let's just stick together regular oven 425. If you've moved your racks around the oven at all, let's make sure we have one of those racks right in the middle. That's where we'll have the most even and best heat for baking our bread. And equipment wise, let's talk about some of the things we'll need. We won't be doing, we'll be doing a little bit of chopping with, of course, our veggies, but having a sturdy cutting board will be very helpful. We'll definitely be needing a few bowls for making our bread. If you're using a stand mixer, that's completely fine. I'll walk you through that. It's effectively the same exact steps. I'm just making the focaccia by hand. If your cheese is not grated, let's have a grater handy. A box grater is great. I'm using a microplane today. If you're using carrots or any veggies that need to be peeled, having a peeler handy will make your life a lot easier. I'll be using a carrot to decorate my focaccia, so I'll be peeling that carrot a little bit later. And then having some measuring spoons, using a cup measure for our bread flour. And of course, we'll be needing a baking sheet. So I'm going to be making the focaccia a little bit freeform. So you don't need to fit the focaccia precisely into your baking pan, but you want to make sure you have a pan so that when we lay our dough out, we end up with about a 1/2 inch either lip, or it could be larger, but let's make sure we have a sided baking pan. And with that, let's get started. So I want you to grab either your stand mixer bowl or just a large mixing bowl. And let's run your tap water. So for our yeast, We don't want super cold tap water. You want to think about it as kind of like tepid bath water. So our recipe says about 80 degrees. We want to stay anywhere between 80 and let's call it 110 or so. Too hot and our yeast will die. Too cold and we won't really activate that yeast. And I'm going to go ahead and add that yeast right into my mixing bowl. And when you have that tap water kind of lukewarm, let's measure 2 cups of water. And add that water right into the bowl with the yeast. And once you've done that, let's grab our honey. I'm just using local clover honey today. And we're going to add 2 teaspoons of honey right into our water yeast mix. Now, we're using the honey instead of sugar today, but it's the same idea that the yeast will effectively feed off of that sugar in the honey. And I'm just going to take a fork. You can use a small whisk. And I'm just going to give that a little swirl just to get it combined. And I'm going to set it aside for a few minutes to let that yeast bloom in our water honey mixture. How's everybody doing with that step? Good.
We got some thumbs up.
Awesome. So next, let's start measuring our flour. So the trick is very often when we're measuring, we tend to have this thought that we need to compact the flour to get that full cup. You may have seen, if you watch Food Network, Barefoot Contessa has these beautiful glass jars of flour, and she kind of picks up that flour and fluffs it a little bit in that jar. That's what we're going for. So I'll show you a little trick here. I'm just using regular King Arthur bread flour. And I have my 1 cup measure. So I'm going to kind of dunk my, there we go, cup measure and kind of fluff up that flour. This is a fresh bag. It's about 5 pounds and it's very full. So you can imagine when it's been shipped, that flour really settles and is packed into the bag. So we want to aerate that flour a little bit. So I'm kind of reaching down into the bag, giving it a little fluff. If you look on my overhead, you can kind of see what I'm doing. And I'll actually hold up in my frontal camera so you can see. So I'm going to go into the bag of flour, take a cup that's kind of heaping, and then I'm going to take a flat knife, and you can use any implement, and I want you to kind of brush off this top layer of flour so that we end up with a flat measurement. So if you look on my overhead, you'll see the kind of idea I'm going for here. So we end up with a cup like so, but it's not compacted with that flour. So I'm going to go ahead and measure 5 cups of flour in that way right into my bowl.
And this is a separate bowl, right, Chef? Not the water.
Yes, I'm measuring in a separate bowl. Well, ultimately, of course, I'll end up in that bowl with the yeast, but I like to measure the flour separately with my other dry ingredients. So that way we don't end up with clumps of our salt or our baking powder. So I'm at 3 cups. I need 2 more. Now this is what we call a fast focaccia. So adding our vinegar and the baking powder will kind of help things along. Okay. How's everybody doing with their measuring?
Looks like we're still doing a little measuring.
Good. I know, especially when you have a fresh bag of flour, it's a little, you're kind of trying to get in there, juggle the measuring cup. So I can relate to that.
Come on back down, babe.
And I can start to smell that yeast is blooming in the water. I'm sure if your bowl is sitting right next to you, you can smell that kind of bready smell happening already. And I'm going to go ahead and grab my baking powder. And I'm adding 2 teaspoons of baking powder right into my flour. So again, that's 2 teaspoons. And that baking powder will give us that really nice lift for this fast focaccia. And then let's also add our salt. We're using 1 teaspoon of salt. I'm using a kosher salt. If you're using a really fine salt, I would recommend adding a little bit less. And I'm going to grab a whisk. If you don't have a whisk, you could use a fork instead. And I'm just going to give those ingredients a good mix together. Again, so we don't have just a big clump of salt or baking powder when we go to mix our flour. How's everybody doing? Are we all measured with our dry ingredients? Good, thumbs up, head shakes, awesome. So let's revisit our blooming yeast here. So you'll see on my overhead, I kind of have some action happening here, right? It's definitely moving and grooving in this bowl, which is exactly what we want. So I'm going to go back to some of my wet ingredients and add 2 tablespoons of olive oil right into my blooming yeast. So again, that's 2 tablespoons. And I would definitely keep that olive oil handy because we will be using it a bit later. One of my favorite things about focaccia is that really lush, oily flavor of that olive oil. And then we're also using some apple cider vinegar today. Did anybody have any problems finding apple cider vinegar? Or are you maybe swapping out an ingredient for a different type of vinegar? I know sometimes it can be a little bit tricky to find. Can you use rice vinegar? I have not used rice vinegar before. Have you, Chef?
Yes, and I think for this, rice vinegar just has a slightly lower or higher pH, a little more, less acidic. So it will work. It's not going to have as strong of a kind of this sour flavor that we're looking for. We're kind of mimicking the sourdough focaccia in our quick focaccia. So that's where our vinegar kind of boosts up that flavor, but rice vinegar will definitely work.
Yes, I have used a red wine vinegar, which again is a little bit different, but we're trying to get that kind of sour flavor that we would get from a longer fermentation from a focaccia.
So go for the white wine vinegar if you have that. If I had the choice between rice wine or white wine vinegar or white vinegar, I would go with the white vinegar so you boost that flavor.
Awesome. And we're going to go ahead and add 2 tablespoons of our vinegar right into our bowl. So that's 2 tablespoons. And I'm going to grab my whisk again and give that a good mix. I'm not going to overdo it, but I want it to be a little bit more combined, get that oil kind of married in with that water. How's everybody doing with this step? Good, awesome.
Good.
Now, I feel like there's generally a great debate with this type of thing. Chef, would you add your wet to your dry or your dry to your wet when you're making focaccia?
Great question. I'm going to go with adding the wet to the dry. I think it avoids kind of a poof situation of flour getting everywhere.
I agree. And I kind of like, if you've ever made pasta, I like to make a little bit of a well. It kind of helps things out a little bit. So I just take the back of my hand right in the center of the bowl and kind of move that flour aside. I just move my hand in a circular motion. And I'm going to go ahead and add that liquid mixture. We have our yeast, our oil, and I'm going to start kind of folding in my flour. I know we have a lot of seasoned cooks on this video today, so I'm sure we have some pasta aficionados. I know Chef definitely is a pasta aficionado. And I'm going to go ahead and add the rest of my water mixture. Now, this will be very sticky. It's a little bit of a lesson in patience. So don't worry, it will come together, but yes, it will be very sticky. And of course, as we add more and more of that flour in, that helps the stickiness factor. Chef, do you have a favorite type of focaccia that you like to make?
I'm kind of a purist. I don't necessarily like all the additions. I love the garden on top, but I kind of just love a plain flavored focaccia. I love the flavor of the olive oil.
Same.
But you could certainly add any number of things to this: olives or rosemary or thyme, fresh herbs. You know, if you really want to, cheese would work in here as well.
I love that. Like a hard cheese would be delicious.
So you're just using your hand, but would you use, I mean, you could use a paddle attachment or a hook attachment.
Absolutely. Yes.
Be...
Is anybody using a stand mixer? Kate, yeah, yep. Well done. And Gretchen, awesome. Yeah, we never know with these classes. Sometimes, you know, we have guests with us who are very well equipped at home and others that, you know, are preferring to use their hands. So I'm with you on that. Okay, so at this point, we should have a pretty well-formed ball. You'll notice I have my little side bowl here. I do have a bunch sticking to my hands. That's fine. You don't need to be worried that that little bit of dough isn't in the bowl with you. We're trying to get the majority of our flour in. If you have, a ton of flour still in your bowl, you definitely want to keep kneading it to get that incorporated. I have a little bit on the bottom, so I'm just going to work it a little bit more. But the idea here is we don't want to overwork the gluten, and we want to give our focaccia a little bit of a chance to rest. So I'm just going to leave it in my bowl here. I'm going to grab a side towel and cover it with the towel and give my hands a wash. And I'll meet you back here.
So we're really just looking to get all of that dry flour incorporated, get it to what we know to be a homogeneous dough. Would you say it's relatively smooth, Chef, or is it kind of broken? Where would you knead it until?
Mine still has, it's not a totally homogeneous mass. So you'll see I have a little bit of kind of folds happening, but that's okay. Now that my hands are clean, I'm going to give it one more kind of a once over in the bowl. It's a little hard, as I'm sure those of us that are using our hands, when you have that kind of shaggy mess from the dough on your hands, it gets a little tricky kneading it in the bowl. But I want to get a little bit more of that flour incorporated. And what we're going to do is let this rest, and then we are going to come back and knead it again. So I'm just going to put paper towel over it and just set it to the side for now. And Chef, let's set about a 10-minute timer. We may go a little bit quicker in terms of how long we let it rest, depending on, time. We are, after all, doing a quick focaccia. So you may have made this in the past and let it proof a lot longer in between the kneading.
We did have, from Gable, we do have a question. Theirs looks stickier than yours. Is that going to be okay? Should we just let that rest as well, or should we add more flour?
Yeah, that's okay. Just let yours rest. If it's still overly sticky in the next round, we can add a little bit extra flour, but don't worry about it.
Thank you.
Of course. And if it's like way too sticky to handle, you can rub your hands very quickly under water, kind of wash them off, and that'll kind of help form your dough into a little bit of a ball, but don't worry about it. Just let it hang out and rest a little bit in that bowl for now. So we have our, we have our dough hanging out. Let's start thinking about our decoration for our focaccia. So I would love, you're welcome to come off of mute or pop into the chat and let me know what vegetables you got. I have kind of a small menagerie here. I have some chives and scallions. I have a carrot. I have some chili marinated olives. I also have kind of the last of summer tomatoes and some little mini sweet peppers as well. You may have gotten some seeds, asparagus. Are you using other herbs? And let's get creative. So you can make flowers. You can just kind of have your veggies in a medley, however you'd like. I love kind of cutting, if you have any of these mini peppers, cutting them into rounds and then using them to create flower petals. Something to think about once we get to the point of dressing our focaccia is that the bread will puff up and spread. So we want to make sure that whatever we're placing, we have enough goodies so that when our bread kind of puffs up, our flour isn't like this when we put it on the bread and then the petals are really spread out. So that's something to think about. Let's make sure that we have a good amount of veggies and seeds or whatever you're using. So we have a really abundant amount of decoration on our focaccia. And if you maybe are using an ingredient that I don't have and you have a question, how do I make this artsy? Feel free to ask Chef Garrison or myself, and we're happy to walk you through it. Chef, have you made a garden focaccia before?
Oh yeah, and I think tomatoes are kind of my go-to. But yeah, and I love the herbs on there. But I would kind of go with these. Olives are a fun addition. Petals of cutting those either the coins like you're doing, or cutting the sides off of peppers and kind of creating maybe rainbows, and there's all different types of things we could do. The seeds, I love that idea too, kind of sprinkling some seeds on it. Looks like Kate has some lavender there, maybe.
Very good. Yeah, we picked some lavender off our plant. We weren't sure if we could use it or not, but it's pretty.
Oh, I love that idea.
Definitely.
That actually brings up a really great point. You could make a sweet focaccia. So you could even brush the top of your focaccia with a little bit of honey and olive oil and put the lavender on. You could, even put a little goat cheese in your focaccia, kind of mix it up. So that is actually really wonderful. And I've never used lavender on a focaccia. And I see Gretchen has a question about thinly sliced garlic. That is a great question. Yes. And my other recommendation, and we will go through this, is brushing it with olive oil before we put it in the oven. So it kind of helps temper that heat. So it'll kind of cook a little bit more gently versus just like a dry heat from the oven. That is a great question. And as I cut my goodies, I'm kind of just lining them up on a little side tray so that my mise en place is all ready to go when we're ready to create our artwork. Did anybody else pick some herbs from their garden? Or did you get a little creative at the supermarket? If you're using a heartier vegetable like a carrot, I would recommend slicing it a little thinner than you might think you need to. Oh, Hannah has fresh cherry tomatoes. Chris, chives, beautiful. Jake, basil. Oh, basil flowers, beautiful. I love that. I'm just going to peel my carrot. I love using chives. I think I'll be using chives as some decoration as grass for my focaccia. The beauty of these is each time they come out a little bit different. So just to kind of reiterate where we're at, we have our ovens preheating to 425. We've mixed our dough together and it's resting for now. We're just prepping some of our toppings for our focaccia. I hope those creative juices are flowing. I tried to find little baby rainbow carrots, but I was unsuccessful today. So I had to settle for just a regular garden variety carrot. But this is also fun. I guarantee you have, flour in your kitchen. You probably have yeast. I know a lot of us were baking bread during lockdown times. And I'm sure you have, the odd pepper, the odd carrot, the odd shallot or onion, clove of garlic. This is something you could kind of make on a whim, and you can kind of have a kitchen sink focaccia, if you will. This is great to do with kiddos. Get them to eat their vegetables, right? Is anybody stumped at any of your vegetables that you may have chosen today?
Looks like we're all on the right track.
Good. For I have some little cherry and grape tomatoes. I'm just having them kind of north to south. I can't believe we're close. Well, we're officially in fall now, right? But I know at the green market here in New York, we're kind of savoring. We're getting the very last of the berries and the last of those really beautiful summer tomatoes. So this is a great excuse to kind of have a summer hurrah while we still can. So I have some olives that I'm cutting now. I'm going to do half kind of long ways, and then half I'm going to cut so I have little rings. But I love using these as kind of like a dirt or stone. And I'm just taking a peek at my dough, and I'm sure if you look at yours, you'll notice that it's grown quite a bit. So I want us to take a little break from our artistic talents and let's knead our dough one more time.
Exactly 10 minutes there, Chef.
Oh, great. My internal clock, what can I say? So I'm just going to keep working in the same bowl. And for those of you that had a sticky dough, feel free to give your hands a little bit of a wipe down with water, not too much water, but this will really help the dough from sticking to your hands as you're working with it. And let's knead our dough for a minute or so. And as I'm kneading mine, I'm definitely feeling it's sticking to my hand for sure. I'm probably going to go to the sink and grab a little reservoir of water. And I'm kind of rotating. You can either rotate the whole bowl, or you can fold the dough over on itself and then kind of push down with the heel of your hand and then rotate the ball or the whole bowl again. And of course, those of you that are using a stand mixer, I would just let it run for a minute or so and then let it rest again. Mine is a little bit sticky, but it's really not sticking to my hand too much. Those of you that had a stickier dough, how are you feeling? Feel free to hop in the chat or come off of mute or flail at Chef Garrison. You can let me know in case I can't see you in the gallery here.
It's much better, Gable said.
Awesome.
So,
good.
yeah.
Good. And I'm actually going to grab a clean bowl. So I had some kind of little bits and pieces of that dough stuck in my other bowl, which is fine, but I'm just kind of a neat freak. I like to have a cleaner surface when I'm doing this kneading. So I'm just going to knead it for a little bit longer. We want a bit more of like a homogeneous mass this time. And you'll notice that the color is kind of evening out. You shouldn't have lumps of flour. And it's definitely getting a bit stickier. I'm going to just grab a little bit of olive oil and just put a little bit on my hands. And I'm going to give that dough a little massage. I'm going to put a little bit in the bottom of my bowl. If you're using a stand mixer, you don't really need to do this part, but this will just help us when we go to turn it out onto our pan. So you'll notice I now have my dough and I'm kind of giving it a poke and it bounces right back. It's a little slow, but again, I don't want to overdevelop the gluten, but now that I've worked it a little bit, I want to give that dough a little bit of a chance to rest again. So chef, I believe our recipe calls for another 10 minutes or so, but for the sake of time, because hopefully we'll be able to show our finished product to each other, let's call it 8 minutes.
Got it.
Thank you. And I'm going to give my hands another wash. Chef, do we have any questions about maybe sticky doughs or dry doughs or anything of that nature?
From the dough that I saw, everybody I think was on the right track. So it's more going to be about allowing this dough now to rust again and relax that gluten structure that we've built up so that we can spread it onto our baking sheet in a few minutes.
Great.
Any questions out there, gang?
Gable, it's much better. Great. Yeah, it's sort of, if you've never made this type of bread before, or bread at all for that matter, it can be a little intimidating. You think, oh gosh, this is really wet and it's not going to come together. And then it's like, you know, you knead it a little bit and you let it rest a little bit and it really just kind of starts to work with you. You have a little bit more of a give and take. So let's go back to our decoration for our focaccia. So far I have some sweet pepper rings. I have some kind of coins of carrot. I have some halved tomatoes. And then I have kind of a mixed bag of olives. Some I did lengthwise and some I cut into rings. And then I also have some scallions from the green market. So I'm just going to give these a trim and a little bit of a rinse under the sink. I really like using the scallions as like a tree trunk or a flower stalk. Did we have success with any basil flowers, Kate? So if you have scallions, I'm kind of delicately peeling back what I can to kind of break this down, but I want to keep those really lengthy pieces for my focaccia. And then when I get to the center stalk, I'm just going to give it a slice down that white part and then kind of gently pull it apart. So it'll look very organic. And there's really no wrong way to decorate. I don't know anyone that's made the same focaccia decoration twice. And then I have some chives here. I'm going to cut mine probably into about 2-inch pieces to use them as sort of a grassy decoration. And again, I'm just using a tray here to kind of line up my ingredients so they're at the ready when I am. Chef, other than focaccia, do you have a favorite type of bread you like to make?
Oh boy, oh boy. I'm kind of partial to maybe a nuttier, seedy kind of multi-grain situation, but I don't know. Good focaccia goes a long way. It can basically go with anything, and especially this one has that. You get those points for the Instagram photo with this one too. So
For sure. So in case anybody joined us a little bit later, we do have our ovens preheating to 425. While this is a fast focaccia, we don't want to skip those steps of letting our bread rest. So we'll definitely decorate together. We'll get our focaccias in the oven together. And of course, make our pesto together. We may not get to final products. I know we have an 8:30 Eastern time stop. If you have kitchen shears, those are a really wonderful, very useful tool to have. Those work really well for things like chives and scallions as well. And even for herbs, if you are going for more of a chopped effect. How's everybody doing with their decoration? If you've done finishing your decoration, feel free to kind of clear the decks a little bit, get some of those dishes into the dishwasher. If you're kind of waiting for the next step, we didn't talk about this, but if you have a pastry brush, that will come in very handy. If you don't have a pastry brush, if you have some clean paper towels, that'll work really well for kind of brushing our focaccia with some olive oil before we go into the oven. And of course, I still have my olive oil handy, and I've kept some coarse kosher salt handy, or you may be using Malden salt flakes for dusting your bread. I'm just going to get some of these dirty implements out of the way that we won't be using anymore. And if you haven't already, give your basil a good wash. Sounds like a bunch of us have kind of homegrown basil. I love that. You can't get any more farm to table than backyard basil, right?
And we have about 1 minute left on our timer for our second rise of our dough.
Great. So let's also start thinking about where are we baking our bread, right? So I'm going to grab a baking sheet. And if you have parchment paper at home, that would be very handy. I would not recommend wax paper. It is not oven safe. I have not used aluminum foil instead of parchment in this capacity. What do you think about that, Chef?
I would probably just, again, I mean, I think parchment's the way to go. Aluminum foil isn't going to make too much of a difference, because of the amount of oil that we're using, which is a good thing, in my opinion, it's going to be basically non-stick. So we don't risk too much there. Parchment paper definitely will help, clean up a little bit and just ensure that it's easy to slide that focaccia off of the tray.
Agreed. Absolutely.
I would probably just go parchment or nothing, as long as your tray is nice and clean.
Yes, agreed. So if
And that was our timer, Chef. Sorry.
Thank you. So I have a sheet tray here that I have lined with parchment paper. And I have my dough here. And I want you to get your dough. And at this point, it's not feeling sticky at all. I'm kind of touching it and my hand is not sticking at all. So I'm going to take my dough and turn it out onto my parchment lined baking sheet. And I'm going to kind of start pressing it down with my fingers and forming it out into the pan. If you're using a larger baking sheet, don't feel like you have to fit the dough to the sheet. We want to end up with about a 1/2 inch thick dough. So I would recommend just kind of taking your fingers and start pushing that dough out. If it's very sticky, you can wet your little fingertips again, or even better, drizzle a little bit of olive oil onto your dough, and that'll help your fingers from sticking. And I kind of recommend working from the center out so that you end up with a relatively even dough. I'm going to take a little bit of olive oil and just drizzle a little bit. And it's okay if it ends up a little bit more free form.
Would you mind showing us a close-up of the thickness of your dough, Chef?
I'm still working it a little bit, but for me, I'm using a 1/4 sheet tray. So I'm going to try to get, as wide as I can into the corners. Also, if yours is a little thicker, that's okay. It'll take a little bit longer to bake. And then we want to let it rest again. And Chef, I believe our recipe calls for a 25-minute rest this time.
It does, but especially in a warm place, maybe on top of the oven, you can probably accelerate that to something like 10 minutes.
Yeah, I agree. Especially, I'd love for us to, of course, get into the oven and whatnot together. So let's let it rest one more time. I'm covering mine with a clean. Go ahead, Chef.
You could even, because just the decorating is going to take a little bit of time, right? So I think you could probably move into decorating the top as it's rising at the same time. So if you really want to get meticulous with your artwork today, we could take some time to do that.
Yeah, let's do it. I'm assuming since everybody has their ovens on, everybody's kitchen is pretty kind of toasty all over. Nobody's maybe under an air conditioning vent. The idea here is we want to let it rise in a warm spot. So if you're maybe working next to your oven or right behind your oven, that's a great place to do it. So that's a great idea, Chef. Let's get decorating. So
and should we brush, did have a question, should we brush with olive oil first?
Yes, before we get decorating, I highly recommend that. So I'm kind of a more the merrier type of dresser. I'm going to start with about 2 tablespoons of olive oil right onto my bread, and I'm using a pastry brush. If you don't have a pastry brush, you can use a paper towel. That works very well.
And Chef David's already got his focaccia decorated here, gang. It's
Oh, beautiful.
awesome.
Oh, that's gorgeous. Gorgeous. Well done.
got the little artist alongside.
I love it. So if you're using kind of delicate herbs, we're definitely going to want to give them another little brush before we go into the oven a little bit later. So I'm going to use my chives as a little bit of kind of grass here. I'm really kind of grouping it together, piling it on. Bread, as I mentioned earlier, will kind of spread out and puff out. And mine already is kind of puffing up even as I'm decorating. And I'm really pressing in my goodies into the dough so it really sticks. I'm sure everybody's busy meticulously decorating. Even my scallions are certainly long for my bread, so I will be grabbing my kitchen shears to give them a little trim. I'm putting my tomato kind of flesh side up. And I'm going to add some of these olives at the bottom as a stone or two. Is anybody making any animals out of their goodies?
Looks like we're all going for the garden technique, or Gretchen did a flower looking configuration.
Oh, Gretchen, that's beautiful. Yeah, no bunny rabbits or anything in the garden. That's going to be the next TikTok trend, I guarantee it.
And what did you do with your carrots, Chef? Did you just slice those?
I just slice mine into kind of coins or rings, just pretty thin. I'm going to grab those kitchen shears and give my scallions a little bit of a trim.
I think you encouraged some animal shapes to happen.
Oh, good. Well, I can't wait to see them. There's really no wrong way to decorate a focaccia, right? And if you end up with an overabundance, like I will definitely have some extra veggies. You have a little crudité to nibble on while you wait for your focaccia to finish. And this would even be fun, you know, we're getting into kind of fall. Kate's inspired me now to maybe try a sweet focaccia. We have lots of sweet fall veggies coming. I bet you could even kind of thinly slice some butternuts. Or even, you know, lightly roast some veggies and top your focaccia with it. I'm definitely getting a very good rise out of my focaccia as I'm decorating. Looks like some of us are still decorating. And I definitely want us to have time for our pesto as well. Okay, I'm going to leave a little bit of kind of space. And I'm going to go ahead and drizzle my focaccia with a little bit of salt. And I'm going to give it another brush with some olive oil as well on top of those veggies, especially if you're using garlic or delicate herbs. I highly recommend giving them a good brush so that they don't just dry out. And I really want to be able to kind of show you the progress of this. So you're welcome to let yours rest a bit longer, but I'm going to go ahead and go in the oven with mine.
Before you do, can we see a close-up of what you got going on there?
Yes, of course. I never said I was a Van Gogh, but you know. So I'm going into the oven. Chef, could you set a 20-minute timer for me?
You got it.
Thank you. So don't worry, if you are letting yours rest a bit longer, that is totally fine. That is what our recipe calls for. But of course, we are together for a limited amount of time. So I want to make sure that we at least can demo everything together. So let's start thinking about our pesto. So I have some basil here. I have a little bit of parsley as well. Don't worry if you decided not to use parsley, we can just do straight basil. I also have some pine nuts or pignoli nuts. Mine are raw, so we will be toasting those together. I also have some Parmesan cheese. You might be using a pecorino, that works too. And then of course we have some garlic as well. So if you haven't washed your basil yet, let's give it a good wash and dry. I also recommend if you have like a mini prep, you'll see I just put one on my overhead, or a food processor, that will come in very handy. I also want us to toast our pine nuts. So I'm just going to bring my little stovetop here. And I just have a regular small pan. And I'm going to turn my heat on super, super low. And I would recommend, you know, we have our ovens on, let's just toast them in the oven, but our oven is really hot and I don't want those pine nuts to burn. So I would recommend let's toast them on our stovetop. And I would even recommend adding a touch of olive oil to the pan to kind of help things go along, and it'll kind of help those nuts from not burning. I'm sure we've all been there that, you know, we're toasting nuts on the pan, we turn our back for 1 second and then they burn. So I have my pan on really, really low heat, and I just added a little bit of olive oil to the pan. And I'm going to go ahead and add those nuts in and just kind of let them come up to a little bit of warmth in that oil. And in the meantime, I'm going to start peeling my garlic. We're going to need 3 cloves. If you don't love garlic and you have big garlic cloves, you're welcome to use less. If you're a big garlic lover, you can certainly use more. This recipe is really more of a guide. And I, of course, always recommend doing things to taste, especially when we're making things like pesto. You know, depending on the point of the summer, the herbs can get a little sweeter or a little more bitter. I have some really large garlic cloves, so I think I'll just use 2 today. And my favorite quick way to get that paper off is to just lay the garlic flat on my board, and then take the flat of my knife and put it on top of the garlic, and then watch those fingers press very gently, and you kind of crack that paper and it comes right off. I have some, there we go. I have some very fresh garlic, and we're pureeing effectively this garlic anyway. So I've smashed it, and that works perfectly for me. I'm just going to take off that little kind of woodsy stem, and I'm going to go right into my pan with the pine nuts or pignoli nuts and get that garlic kind of flavorful, get those oils really moving. We're not looking to get any color on the garlic, but we're kind of taking the edge off. Again, I have some big garlic cloves, so I'm kind of giving them a little bit of a chop and right into my pan. How does everybody feel with garlic peeling? I'm going to give my pan a little shake. It's already getting fragrant. I don't want those nuts to burn. I'm using a 1/4 cup of pine nuts. And while that's hanging out, I'm keeping a very close eye, and I'm going to start picking the basil off of the stem. So we don't want this woodsy part on the bottom. So we're just picking the leaves, and we'll need about 2 cups. Again, it doesn't have to be an exact science, but for this recipe, we'll do just about 2 cups. Some of my basil leaves have a little bit of kind of brown on the top. I'm just going to pick that brown part off, but the rest of the leaf is perfectly good. And my pine nuts are getting very fragrant. They're kind of sizzling very gently. And I'm just going to give my pan a shake. I don't want them sitting in the same spot for too long. We don't want them to burn on one side. But we're kind of getting those oils moving and grooving. We're taking the edge off of that raw garlic. And we're not really looking for too much color on the pine nuts. We'll get a little bit of kind of a light caramel color on some of them, but we're really going for a very, very light toast. And if you have your back to the stove with your pine nuts on, let's just make sure we keep our eyes and ears on that pan. I'm going to kind of give mine another little shake. Pretty sure this is probably the last week I'll be able to get fresh basil at the green market here in the Northeast. So again, we're looking for about 2 cups of basil for our pesto recipe. And I'm gonna give my nuts a little bit of a shake again. And if you look on my overhead, there's a little bit of toasting. They're a little bit darker than they're coming up on the camera, but that's just about where I want to leave it. I can smell the garlic is really fragrant, and then the nuts are definitely very, very lightly toasted. So I'm going to turn the heat off on the stove and just let those kind of hang out and cool down just a little bit while we finish our herbs for our recipe. So I definitely have a good 2 cups of basil. And then I need about 2 tablespoons of parsley. So I've kind of already taken off that woodsy bottom of my parsley, and I'm just going to give this a rough chop. They're all going to go into the food processor, so I don't need to worry too much about kind of doing all that knife work. And I'm just going to set my herbs aside. And we're also going to be needing some cheese. So I believe we need about a 1/4 cup of grated cheese. I'm using a Parmesan. And these microplanes, if you don't have one, come in very, very handy. They're great for grating hard cheeses, garlic, ginger, zesting citrus. If you're using a box grater, that works too. You might even have the grater attachment if you're using like a Cuisinart food processor. So we need about a 1/4 cup or so. If you're using a microplane, it tends to kind of make very light flakes of cheese. So I'm probably doing a little bit over a 1/4 cup if you're using a microplane. And I'm just going to grab a little rubber spatula. And if you haven't set up your food processor already, let's get that going. And I'm going to go ahead and put that garlic pine nut mixture right into my food processor. I'm sure everybody's kitchens are getting very fragrant right about now. And then let's also add some salt. So we'll need 1/2 teaspoon of salt, and I'm adding that right into my food processor. And I'm just going to give that a quick pulse or 2 just to break up those nuts a little bit. Beautiful. So I do this first because I don't want to over process those herbs. I'm sure we've all kind of done this before, and you might end up with kind of an army green pesto. So that can happen if you over process those herbs. They'll kind of turn that army green color. So I'm going to go ahead and add right in my processor. And then we're also going to need about a 1/4 cup of olive oil. And I'm going to start getting those herbs into my mini prep. I might need to add them in 2 batches since I'm working with a smaller piece of equipment, but If you're using a large processor, you can probably go all at once. And again, I'm going to just kind of pulse it to chop those herbs. Give them a little push down. And I am going to add a little bit more olive oil. Our recipe calls for about a 1/4 cup plus 2 tablespoons, but I want to make sure that there's enough kind of liquid in there to shimmy that all those herbs. And I'm just adding a touch more oil. I was a little generous with my basil. It was probably over 2 cups, so just need a little bit of extra oil. Now, if you prefer a really fine pesto, you're welcome to give it another blend and let it go a little longer so it's thinner. I like for the focaccia to have a little bit of a thicker pesto, so it kind of stays onto the focaccia when I dip it in, but it's complete personal preference. But very important, of course, is that we taste our pesto. So I'm just grabbing a little spoon. Let's give it a taste. It's good. Needs a little bit of salt. If you like pepper, you can add a little bit of cracked pepper. I'm just going to give it one more whirl. And then grab a little dish for plating. And Chef, how are we doing on our timer?
We have 4 more minutes. We'll be at the 20-minute mark.
Great. And you can totally get creative with these pestos. If you don't always have pine nuts, if you have almonds in the house, walnuts, pistachios are really delicious. You don't always have to use basil. We buy cilantro or parsley for recipes, and then we end up with extra. You can get creative, just as creative as we got with our focaccia decoration. Mine looks very dark on camera, but darker on camera than it appears in real life. How's everybody doing with their pesto? Have you tried it yet? Chris, that looks great. Get everybody back gallery view. So our focaccia's baking away in the oven. You may have waited a little bit to let yours rest a bit longer. That is completely fine. Does anybody have any questions while we're kind of waiting on our focaccia?
Gable's enjoying the pesto.
Awesome. And if you have a lot of extra basil, you want to make extra pesto, you could freeze this. If you have little plastic containers, that works really well. Ice cube trays works really well. This is a nice thing to add a little bit of freshness if you're making a soup. You can kind of throw a cube or 2 of your pesto, frozen pesto in to add a little freshness, especially, we're going into fall and winter, so it's nice to have that little remind summer, right?
Yep. One question here, how will we know when the focaccia is done?
That is a great question. So it will, you'll have kind of a golden brown on the top. And it should lift, once you let it cool a bit, it should lift out quite easily. If you knock on the bottom, it'll kind of knock back. I know Chef Garrison is a bread aficionado as well. Do you have any tips or tricks, Chef?
Yeah, I'd say, really because of the thickness of this, if you stuck to that ½ inch, if you had a ruler and you knew that you weren't closer to an inch, really at that ½ inch mark, you're pretty safe. When that top is nice and golden, deep golden brown, you're going to be really safe with it being completely cooked. It would also be about just kind of touching it. Obviously it's going to be hot. If you pulled it out of the oven and you allowed it to rest for a second, and like you said, knock back. If you kind of have a hollow, kind of firm sound, the focaccia doesn't dig in, but it kind of bounces back, and it kind of sounds hollow and crisp on the outside. You'll be in pretty good shape. Worst case scenario, if you're questioning it, if you get it nice and deep golden brown, you're going to be in good shape. The only thing to look for would be if you have a spatula, maybe to get underneath it, just because obviously the part that's touching the pan, the underside, and if it had some oil there, that's going to get a little darker than the top will. So we just want to make sure that that bottom doesn't get too dark as we're waiting for the top to get golden, deep golden brown. And you're right at your 20-minute mark, Chef. Do you want to show us what you've done so far? And that's where it's going to vary a little bit. If you're 20 minutes at a ½ inch, maybe a little bit longer if you thought your focaccia was a little bit thicker. So that's where our variance is probably closer to 30, 35 minutes, I'd say, would be a sweet spot.
For sure. And mine is definitely puffing up for sure.
Wow.
I'm going to set mine down for a second here. So you'll see, you can see on there. I'm starting to get some good color on mine. I'm going to give mine another little brush because my chives are getting a little bit toasty, which is to be expected if you're using these kind of more delicate herbs. But I'm probably going to need another 15 minutes or so. And I love a really olivey, olive oil-y focaccia. So I'm going to go back into the oven. And how is everybody checking theirs?
Kate had a question.
How are you doing?
Kate had a question just regarding altitude. Altitude is probably the conundrum here. If anything, altitude is going to accelerate the cooking of this. So it would probably be a little bit less time. I'd say closer to maybe 25 to 30 minutes. And, it also depends on the efficiency of your oven. If you have a new oven that's super efficient, that's going to affect how quickly this happens. But I'd say for altitude, you go a little bit less time. And then as Adrianna, you could see hers was turning nice and golden brown, but she's going to kind of wait until it gets deep golden brown.
For sure. And, I encourage you to keep giving it a brush. If you don't need to babysit it too often, definitely set that timer. But giving it a good brush with olive oil will kind of help you achieve that golden brown color. And of course, that's what I think of when I think of focaccia, that really kind of luscious olive oil when you bite into it. And of course, eating it with our pesto will add to that. But olive oil, it's so healthy for you. It's good for your skin. It's good for your heart. So I'm like a more the merrier kind of person when it comes to olive oil. Don't be scared of oil.
And then do you have any tips for resting this when we feel like we've gotten it cooked and nice and golden brown and we're kind of around that, 35-minute mark? how should we, are we ready to eat it straight away, or do we want to pull it out of the pan? What would you suggest?
Yeah, I would recommend leaving it in the pan for about 5 minutes or so, and then pulling it off. If you're planning on, if you want to eat it warm, by all means. If you really want to have kind of moist leftovers tomorrow, I would recommend letting it rest a little bit longer, just to kind of give it a chance to temper out with the temperature. Obviously, when we pull it out of the oven, think about like when you're roasting a chicken or making a steak, you want to kind of let it rest. So I have the same philosophy when it comes to bread baking as well.
And I think especially with focaccia, when you let that rest, you're allowing that structure of that gluten structure to solidify, and you're gonna, I think the perfect focaccia is, especially on the edges, a little bit crisp and then very soft on the inside. And the beauty of this too is that it does reheat really well. So even if you were to leave it out and let it completely cool down to room temperature, you can certainly pop this back into the oven, or slice it and re-toast it in a pan with some olive oil. So many different versatilities to use this with.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like focaccia is one of those breads that's really forgiving and it likes to be reheated again. It makes really beautiful croutons. If you have, if for some reason you don't finish your focaccia, throw some more olive oil in, cube them up. If you have some dried herbs, or maybe you got rosemary today to bake your with your focaccia, give it a toss in some herbs and olive oil and a little bit of salt, and put them in a low oven and let them crisp up. And then you can kind of stretch your focaccia even longer, and then you won't have any go to waste. And they'll keep in an airtight container for quite some time. It's the gift that keeps on giving, this bread. Has everybody given theirs a check? How are we doing? Are you feeling good about it? We have a few more minutes, so I will pull my bread out in a minute or so to give you one last peek before I let you go. And of course, if you have any questions about your bread or any other cooking questions, you have two seasoned chefs here with you today, so we're happy to answer any questions at all. There are no dumb questions in the kitchen, so don't be shy. Any ingredient questions or bread questions, pasta making questions, you name it.
I'll ask a question. I have a plum tree that produces 4 million plums every year all at once.
Oh.
And so I made jam, but any other recommendations to do with plums?
Wow.
Yes, I would make a plum galette. You can just Google like a galette dough recipe. It's super, super easy. Obviously, Kate, you're a seasoned cook, so I have every faith in you of making a galette, but that would be my recommendation. Even if you have a ton, you can pit them, have them, and freeze them on a sheet tray, and then you can kind of come back to them all through the winter, so you can make a plum tart in the dead of winter, which is really nice. And even just using them for smoothies. I'm a big smoothie person. So what about you, Chef?
Yeah, I'd say pickled plums, or in the same manner,
Ooh.
coating those in simple syrup and just preserving them. And if you're familiar with the canning process, I love pickled plums in a salad. It makes a really nice vinaigrette, even if they get kind of soft. We had another one. What goes well with this focaccia, would we say? On my side, I'd say just about anything. Obviously, kind of more Italian in me, as an accompaniment to get the rest of that pasta sauce off of the plate would be a go-to. I think most traditionally, this focaccia would be served as an antipasti at the beginning of the meal with some sliced salumi or prosciutto would be delicious. Those would be great things. And then David also asked, what do we get to make next time? So that is an excellent question.
For sure. Yeah,
Tarts.
I'm with Chef that like anything goes, the sky's the limit, just like with your decoration. But I do love prosciutto with focaccia. I also really love ricotta or ricotta with honey with my focaccia. That's why I'm just like a huge fan of ricotta. I love the taste and the texture. And I know, Kate, you have that lavender. If you want to infuse some honey with that lavender to kind of stretch summer a little longer into the colder months, or even like a goat cheese kind of sandwich with your focaccia. But yeah, I think really anything goes. Just think of it, you could do like a ham and cheese with your focaccia. You could do prosciutto with fontina if you really want to make it Italian. So I need a little bit longer on my bread, but you can see I have much more of that kind of golden brown happening. So I'm going to go back into the oven, but I know we're kind of coming up to our time. If anybody is kind of maybe close to being done, or they want to show us their bread before we let you go, by all means. And if you don't eat all your pesto tonight, I recommend definitely putting it in a container, drizzle a little extra olive oil on top to kind of help prevent that browning, even a little bit of saran wrap, or if you have a container that kind of butts right up to the top of the pesto, that'll really help keep that beautiful green flavor color. So you'll have some really good flavor there.
There's some shots. Connie's got hers out. Looks fantastic.
Oh, Connie, that looks
nice,
great.
Deep golden brown, or even close to chestnut brown. Makes
Beautiful.
it really nice.
Yeah, and think about, when you put your focaccia in the oven, is one spot kind of browning quicker. So when you put it back in the oven, give it a little turn, rotate it. Some of our ovens are a little bit hotter in one spot, a little bit cooler in another. It's just the nature of the beast. So the more you make these, the more you bake, you kind of learn what are the hot spots. But that is a good point that I should mention. Give your pan a little rotation if you're not quite there yet, but you're noticing maybe it's a little darker in one spot.
And I did insert our at Fēst.cooking. If you don't take a photo, it didn't happen, but we love to celebrate what you put together. We are so thankful to have you all, and many of you again. Kate, again, thank you so much for having us. We hope this was a success for you and that you try this recipe again, depending on how it turned out. For
sure. Absolutely. If you're on social and you make this again in the future, feel free to take a picture and tag us. We love to share your dishes. And this was so much fun. Thank you, everybody, for baking along with us. And happy eating. Enjoy.
Thank you so much, chefs. And thanks, everybody, for joining.
Thank you. Have a wonderful weekend, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks,
you.
Chef. Bye, Kate. Thank you so much.
Have a good night.